And it's fascinating, right? Because it means that humans, like by moving crops, are kind of like letting, like these bees naturally expand their ranges.
You are listening to Urban Wildlife Podcast.
Hey, podcast listeners. Welcome back to another episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. This is one of your co-hosts, Billy Brown. You might recall that last year we had a couple episodes featuring a local bee researcher, Doug Sponsler, who has been working out of Penn State University, but has recently moved back to the Philadelphia area and is researching the ecology of urban bees, basically. And we had him in for a couple episodes, including one episode where we went to basically my garden and hung out next to a couple squash plants very early in the morning to catch sight of some squash bees, which are specialized solitary bees that, as the name implies, specialize in squash plants. And we talked about them. As you might also know, I also write articles for Grid Magazine, a local environmental publication here in Philadelphia. And so I had pitched to my editors an article about these squash bees. I love squash. I love squash bees. This will come out clearly in the rest of the podcast episode today. But I got them to agree to writing an article about squash bees. Look for it in the edition that should be coming out in early August of 2019. And so for this article, I wanted to interview one of the world experts in squash bees, a professor at Penn State University. Doug was a critical part in connecting us to do this interview. Her name is Margarita Lopez Uribe. And so she has been researching squash bees, various aspects of them, including their, these are my words, their biogeographical history. And she had a publication, an article called Crop Domestication Facilitated Rapid Geographic Expansion of a Specialized Pollinator, the Squash Bee, Peponapis pruinosa, from the Proceedings of the Royal Society of London Bee. As you can tell, I do like to geek out on squash bees. But when this article came out, it was one of those times where you sort of wonder something on your own, and then real experts write an article investigating and describing their much more sophisticated research into the inkling that you had. And so you just it's the most amazing thing in the world. So when I realized that Doug Sponsler actually knew her and could put us in touch, I got really excited. So I'll say the sound quality isn't fabulous. So if this is one of those times where you have the choice to listen to this while you're driving on the highway with a lot of background noise, or wait till later, listen to it in a more quiet setting, maybe listen to it in a little more quiet setting. And we'll work harder on how we record phone calls with better audio quality in the future. So sorry for that. If you do like this podcast and you're listening to this, so we hope so, please rate us highly on your podcast listening app of choice. Please tell your friends about it by whatever means you tell your friends about stuff in general. You can reach us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us at urbwildlifecast. You can find us on Facebook. All these are great ways to give us feedback and to let us know what you think of the podcast and to suggest ideas. And just a little point of geographic clarification for those of you who aren't from the Philadelphia area. We talk a little bit about the geography of Pennsylvania here. In particular, Penn State University is located in a small city called State College, which is in Centre County, which both of these are very literally named places. State College because, hey, that's where Penn State is, and Centre County because it is really smack in the middle of Pennsylvania. And so when we're talking a little bit about where we are respectively, that's where we are. So if you can look on the map, just point your finger right in the middle of Pennsylvania. That's roughly where Margarita Lopez Uribe was when she was talking to me, and I'm here in Philadelphia. One more thing. I want to also make really clear, which we didn't talk about so much in the episode, but that these are easily observable bees, particularly if you live in North America. So if you are someone who grows squash like zucchini or even winter squash like pumpkins or butternut squashes or acorn squashes, you name it, go out to your garden or find a friend who has a garden. Go out really early in the morning because these guys start flying basically right about dawn, and they'll be out for a few more hours after that. And take a look at who's in those flowers. And so what you're looking for is, as we talk a little bit about what they look like, something that's about honeybee size. The bands are narrower than honeybees, and they are particularly shaggy little bees, which you'll notice if you get a view of their whole bodies. I'll point out that most of the time I'm looking at the abdomen sticking up out of the flower because they're face down in squash blossoms drinking up the nectar. And for those who haven't actually seen a squash blossom, look it up. But squash flowers are big yellow kind of trumpet shape or bell-shaped flowers. So with that, we hope you enjoy the discussion about squash bees.
So my name is Margarita Lopez Uribe. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Entomology at the Pennsylvania State University. And I'm an evolutionary ecologist, and I'm broadly interested in understanding how different bee species respond to changes in the environment.
When you say the word bee to people, they have one, maybe two kinds of bees in mind, honeybees and bumblebees maybe. So for people who have, who just haven't discovered the wonderful diversity of bees yet, describe what is a squash bee?
Yeah, so I guess I should kind of start by saying that bees is a group of insects that comprises over 20,000 species worldwide. And in Pennsylvania currently we're actually working on a checklist of all the bees that have ever been recorded in the state. And we have approximately 450 species in Pennsylvania. So yeah, there are, as you say, there is a great diversity of bees. One of these bees is the squash bee. Is a very unique species for multiple reasons. So one of the things that makes squash bees really interesting is that unlike honeybees and bumblebees, which we often see visiting, different flowers, visiting, plants in our garden, in agricultural areas, the squash bees only visit flowers of one plant genus, which is, the plant genus of pumpkins and squashes and zucchini and that type of plants. So these bees specialize in pollen collection of these plant genus, and they are very specialized pollinators of these plants. They look like, they are about honeybee size, okay? But they are a lot hairier. We don't know exactly, we don't know a lot about their physiology, but we think, and this is something that we're starting to look at in the lab, we think that they actually may do something similar as bumblebees do, right? Like bumblebees, for example, they are capable of heating up their bodies when, it's really cold. And this is why they can fly when, when temperatures are low outside, right? And so this is, part of all the hair that bumblebees have is for thermoregulation purposes. So, squash bees are also covered with a lot of hair. What else? I don't know, I feel like for me it's easy to, identify a squash bee. But there are a lot of
my impression when I've seen them is that they're kind of flat looking. Like if I'm used to, because when I see them, I'm usually seeing the looking at them from the back because they're face down in a squash blossom, and I'm looking at their abdomens, and my impression has always been that they look a little bit flatter than my usual thought of my sort of default honeybee shape. But that just might be my impression. I don't know. You are not sounding like you're agreeing with that.
I don't know, but definitely, right. Honeybees don't have a lot of hair, right? So the bands that we see, so when we color.
Yeah, and their bands have little fringes. It looks like, yeah.
But those are hairs, unlike honeybees that you talk actually the integument, which is dark or orange or so these bees are a lot hairier. The males have really long antennae. They have a yellow patch on the clypeus, so it's easy to differentiate them.
Talk a little bit about their ecology. So, I think we have, again, as our default idea of a bee, we have honeybees that live in these big colonies, and they go to all different kinds of flowers and bring it back, and they have these different classes of bees within the colony. So, so if people have that starting point, what is a squash bee like and how it lives?
Yeah, so I guess, that's actually a very interesting and important question because if we are talking about the biology of bees, actually honeybees are very different from, most bees. The squash bees are actually, it's a species that better represents biology of, the majority of bees. So they are solitary, which means that there's only one female per nest. They actually live underground. So, instead of making a nest in a cavity, in a tree or in a box, They actually have to dig, down the ground, and they make tunnels where, they basically, collect the pollen and nectar and bring it back into that tunnel. And then after, they make, a provision, kind of a mass of pollen and nectar combined, they lay an egg and they close that, tunnel. And basically that mom will never see that baby, right? Like that mom dies that year and the egg develops into an adult the following year. That's kind of like the life cycle, which again is more representative of the majority of bees, but squash bees have a very unique and interesting biology, and it's most likely the result of, the tight associations that they have with their host plants. So they actually forage really early in the morning because squash flowers open only for 6 hours during the day. So it is not rare to see squash bees, foraging even before the sun is completely out. And that may be, also associated for one of the reasons why they have, hairs that may help them thermoregulate better. The plants, even though they are visited for nectar by bumblebees and honeybees, the only ones that actually collect the pollen are squash bees. That pollen, we don't know exactly why, but it's pollen that most bees don't like.
My understanding is that squash pollen, the grains are particularly large.
They are large. They are very spiny. So we don't know exactly if it is, a mechanical defense, just because of the size and the shape of the outer part of the pollen grains, or if there is some kind of chemistry that the bees don't like. But basically, only squash bees collect that pollen actively. So it's very interesting because even though, the flowers are huge and they produce tons of nectar and pollen, most bees are not able to actually utilize that resource. It's very interesting.
So you mentioned there's 20,000 odd species of bees worldwide, 400 or more bee species in Pennsylvania. How common is this kind of host specificity? How many other bees are just one genus or one group of plants and one species and that's it?
Yeah, it's not very common. Bees, not all bees are like bumblebees and honeybees that, go to many different hosts. But when we talk about especially bees, oftentimes we're talking about bees that specialize in a plant family, right? So they go to many different hosts within a family.
Squash are not native to where we're talking. You're in State College, I'm in Philadelphia. So how did squash bees get to, let's say, Philadelphia?
Yeah, so it is, of course, something recent. So we think that after domestication of squash and pumpkin plants and widespread cultivation of these domesticated or these crops, then that facilitated the movement of the bees. And so we think that the presence of the squash bees in this part of the world could be as recent as, 5 to, 2,000 years, more or less. So it's relatively recent, and it's fascinating, right? Because it means that humans, by moving crops are kind of letting, these bees naturally expand their ranges. Given the current distributions and past distributions of the plant and the bee, we kind of assume that the presence of the squash bees, here in the Northeast was something recent. But a few years ago, I started looking at the distribution of genetic diversity in across, populations of the squash bees throughout North America and Mexico, where the plants and, presumably the bees were from. And what we found is that given, the genetic information, we actually see a dramatic reduction in the amount of genetic diversity in the populations of the squash bees in the Northeast. That is precisely what one would expect from a demographic expansion, right? So basically there is kind of a founder effect where a group of, individuals colonizes a new area, and so, there is a bottleneck from a genetic perspective, and then you have this reduction. And that's exactly what we see here in the Northeast. And also, to the west, right? And so the squash species has not only moved through the Northeast, but also, like it has extended its range in Utah and Idaho. And there, like we picked up a kind of independent genetic bottleneck there as well.
Okay.
So we think, and this is something that I would like to, like study in the future, we think that other species of the squash bee may have, like done the same thing. So, for example, there are areas of South America and Central America where we know that there are no wild cucurbita plants, but we see squash bees in cultivated, like plants as well. So they are different species, but like it's kind of the same example. Presumably, like the same thing happened. We are currently investigating the similar. We're trying to determine if actually the specialist herbivore of our squash here in the Northeast actually, like follow a similar pattern.
Wait,
right? So,
what do you mean by the herbivore?
The striped cucumber beetle, which, like probably.
I was going to ask you about something else. No, because squash is one of my, winter squashes in particular, like my favorite thing to grow as a gardener. And I'll avoid going on for like an hour about why they're wonderful. But but there's a few like relatively squash specific pests. And so you mentioned the cucumber beetle. I was thinking of the squash vine borer, which is a moth that if you're growing squash is the most like demoralizing pest you can have, because it's got larvae, that develop inside the vines, and you don't notice it until the whole plant just dies.
Yes. Yeah.
And they must have done the same thing, right?
I don't know how specialized that pest is, right?
Okay, but you mentioned the cucumber beetle, so run with that one, yeah.
But with the cucumber beetle, we know that, again, like the squash bee, that is a species that the whole life cycle depends on a squash plant. So, like the larvae need the roots, and then the adults need the leaves and the flowers.
But they eat other cucurbits, so it isn't just the cucurbita genus, right?
No. So there are two groups. One is a specialist, and that's the striped cucumber beetle. There are other species that look very similar, but are actually a different subfamily, and those are generalists. Those go to corn. Those are
those are cutworms,
Yep. But the striped cucumber beetle, like is a specialist on. I mean, they also attack cucumbers, which are closely related.
And so my last question is a little bit more philosophical, or conservationist philosophical. Like, I think, we have a lot of discussions about what we think of as a native species. And so, and I love this example because I feel like it sort of confounds our definitions. Like, so I'm sure you guys talk about this over beers in your lab. Like, how do you regard like a pre-Columbian, like, human commensal species? Is that native? Is it not native? Like, what do you think about it?
Well, so that's a very interesting question, and like we do talk about that a lot, and this is one of the reasons why we moved away from talking about native bees, and now we talk about wild bees to kind of like make the differentiation between like honeybees, which are managed, and, bees that, like may not be completely, like native, but, like they have been naturalized here. This is kind of a natural invasion, right? Like it was not introduced by, like any specific reason, like it just naturally, like happened. And I think, like thinking about broader, you were saying about, in the context of conservation, these, like new species or introduced species are now, like being naturalized in all ecosystems around the globe. And they are creating, new communities. And yeah, I guess, like if we want to be very, conservative and, like think about, pristine, habitats with, like communities that have, evolved there for their whole history, like we have fewer and fewer of those communities. And this is just, like, this is the reality of the Anthropocene, right? Like this is what we see all over the place. So, yeah.
All right, fun topic. Thank you.
It's a tough question.
Oh, it is. No, and it's. I don't know. For me, like it raises all kinds of interesting questions about like how we could go off for hours, like about like how we define wild versus not wild, and like how do you like regard the environmental impact of Native Americans, like versus Western European American, all that kind of stuff. But for another conversation.
I guess, just to add, something else. I guess unlike other, so for example, in Pennsylvania we have 12 truly, like non-native species that have, been introduced from Europe and Asia, right?
Okay.
But unlike the squash bee, those bees are probably competing with other bees for floral resources, right? Squash bees are only really using a resource that we have introduced in our,
right.
in our habitats here. So, it's kind of a very unique example because, I guess, it could probably compete for like places for nesting with other species, but, like the food is really, like the one thing that they use, like they're very specialized on that. We have like two research programs on squash bees right now. So one is being led by graduate student Laura Jones, and she is actually looking at disease dynamics in the squash bees and how farms that have a lot of honeybees and bumblebees for any given reason may be increasing disease pressure in squash bees. And she's also looking at how temperature changes in Pennsylvania can actually be increasing the negative impact of some of the diseases that we're seeing in squash bees. So that's one project. The other project is being led by Kristen Brochu, and she's a postdoc in the lab. And she's actually growing all of these Cucurbita species here near State College. And we're growing the wild host plant ancestor, like the plant that we think co-evolved with squash bees in Mexico and southwest of the U.S.
It's what we call like coyote. What do they call coyote gourds or something like that?
Buffalo
gourd. Okay.
Yes, yeah. And we are also growing all sorts of like wild and domesticated South American and Central American species to actually see if the squash bees that we have here in Pennsylvania have shifted their preferences for different host plants.
All right. Well, hey, we'll wind up, and I'll just say thank you very much for talking.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of the podcast.
Synanthropic organism.
Hey, podcast listeners. We hope you like this interview with Professor Margarita Lopez Uribe. We really appreciate the time she took to talk to us. I'll note that this was also when she was home, like tending to a couple sick kids. So extra thanks for taking the time to talk to us. Thanks again to Doug Sponsor for the connection to make this interview happen. And thanks to all of you for listening. If you like the podcast, of course, please like us on your podcast listening app of choice. Please recommend us to all of your friends. And please don't be a stranger. You can get in touch with us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us at urbwildlifecast. You can find us on Facebook. And we hope you listen to the next episode. Thanks.